this continuum of gender-based violence, there are other manifestations of violence, several other manifestations of violence. And I give examples: sexual harassment can be one, female genital mutilation, verbal abuse, incest, denial of employment, etc., etc. The important thing to understand is that it all lies on the same continuum, and the root causes are the same. The root causes of all these different manifestations of gender-based violence are the same. It is just that you see different manifestations. Okay? I know it's very helpful to think of gender-based violence in terms of, I use the imagery of a tree, where you have branches, the trunk, and roots. This imagery is useful in terms of thinking about root causes. Then the trunk represents what I call facilitating factors. And then the foliage, the leaves, represent manifestations. Many times when I'm discussing gender-based violence with my students, and I ask them, what do you think are the causes of domestic violence? The common answers every year are alcoholism, alcohol abuse, poverty, hot temper, which for me are facilitating factors. They may exacerbate violence, but they are not the root causes. I think it's very important to understand what the root causes are. Okay? It is the way that society is structured and the institutional factors, the rules that govern society. Okay? The public-private divide, man, head of household, those structural issues. Okay? And then the way it manifests itself. It could be, as we've seen, it could be overt, it could be covert, okay, different ways. So I always find that imagery useful. Okay? So think of violence as a continuum. When it comes to domestic violence, I don't know why my diagrams are all messed up, but it's as some of you may have heard about this cycle of domestic violence. Once you have conceptualized violence as being part of, that continuum, so but domestic violence falls along that continuum, different manifestations of domestic violence. Same causes, okay? And theorists have depicted domestic violence as being a cycle. It's like a vicious cycle that happens in 3 main phases. Shouldn't try to, but you imagine it as it should be a proper cycle. Okay, phase 1 is when the period when tension begins to build. Okay, tension is building within the home. one person is being blamed for doing this and not doing that. Every time someone comes home, people get worried. Tension is building, okay? And slowly but surely, that tension will explode into phase 2 when the abusive incident happens. It could be overt, it could be covert. Okay? It could be physical, it could be psychological, it could be economic, but it happens. Okay? And in every incident of domestic violence, there will be another phase that will follow that one, without exception. The only difference is the period between the different phases. So in some cases, the period could be a matter of minutes or a day or two. In others, it could be months or even years. But without any doubt, this cycle will be followed. So phase 3 follows. And phase 3 is known as the honeymoon period. The honeymoon period. Which is where the perpetrator of violence will break down and apologize. I don't know what got into me. I'm so sorry. You know, and the victim will begin feeling that maybe it was her fault or his fault, depending on. Most times it's a she who's on the receiving end. Depending on their social class, he may buy her a new dress or bouquet of flowers, or to do something to show that they're really sorry, okay? And to tell them that, you know, it will never happen again. And then, like night follows day, phase 1. Okay? Again, the only difference is the time, the lapse of time. So that cycle of violence is true for all domestic violence incidents. Okay? Which tells us that unless, if you're going to break that cycle, okay, you must address the root causes. Taking the perpetrator for anger management workshops is not going to do it. Okay, because then you will only be dealing with the facilitating factors, but not looking at the root causes. Okay, so if you're going to break that cycle, if domestic violence has to end, you really must address the underlying root causes of domestic violence. The perpetrator and the victim need to understand issues of gender, their awareness about gender, being gendered beings, you know, gender relations of surveillance that we're talking about. You may not use these big concepts with them, but you need to, the perpetrator, for example, needs to understand that they must respect their partner as an equal human being. That is basic. Because as long as in their mind, this person is inferior to them, this person is like a child, then they will continue thinking that it is their right to chastise them. So the mindset has to be worked on. Okay? Anger management workshops will not be enough. So then why do we add the S in GBV before GBV? In other words, why do we add sexuality? Why do we say sexual and gender-based violence when we know that gender-based violence includes physical violence, which rape is one, for example, and sexual assault? I think it's important to add sexual abuse, to name it, because of its prevalence. It is so pervasive that it requires special mention in order to spotlight the need to address it separately. Sexual violence, I think it is important to recognize that it is not about sexual pleasure. It is not that the rapist, for example, is seeking pleasure. It is not so much about sex. Sex becomes just a means of control and power. So rape is about power and control. Okay? And that is why it is, for example, used in conflict situations. When the Hutus, for example, systematically raped the Tutsis, and Hutus, sympathizers of Tutsis, or moderates as they were called, rape had become a tool. Just like you have a machine gun in war, rape becomes a tool for controlling and showing power over your enemy. And maybe we need to go into the reasons why women are targeted as for sexual assaults during periods of armed conflict, because this has been true since all in history, time immemorial. In all armed conflicts, women are targeted. But I think in contemporary history, it is the war of the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda that come to mind immediately, where women were systematically targeted. Why are women targeted during armed conflict? I think the first reason is obvious, because of the way that women are gendered. Women are gendered as weaker, the weaker sex. So it is easy to target them. So women's vulnerability that is occasioned by gender, makes them an easy target. The second reason, which I think is more important, is women's reproductive role. Because women are viewed as the embodiment of the continuity of the family, the clan, the ethnic group. So as wives, they produce a future generation. So this is perceived as, women are perceived as chaste daughters and chaste wives, symbolizing the family virtue. So when they are targeted during armed conflict through systematic rape, rape becomes a weapon of genocide, literally, through forced pregnancies. So the Hutus believed by raping Tutsi women and implanting Hutu seeds in their wombs, they were going to produce not Tutsi children, babies, but Hutu children. So that was a means of literally doing away with all Tutsis so that women's reproductive role makes them a target, because they symbolize the continuity of an ethnic group. The other reason, of course, is women's not only reproductive role, but also the social production and reproduction that they perform in society. Their role in maintaining societies, through their caring work, through their subsistence labor. So an attack on them is an attack on the socio-economic continuity of the family and of the wider community. Finally, I think women are targeted during armed conflict as targets of systematic sexual violence, because women are perceived not as individuals in their own right, but as extensions of their fathers, husbands, brothers, ethnic groups. So women are never viewed as independent, autonomous individuals, but as part of their families, their husbands, and so on. So attacks on women may also represent an assault on the honor of her entire community. Okay? It's humiliation, it's degradation. So public rape terrorizes and traumatizes the civil population. It symbolizes defeat when men fail to protect, quote unquote, their women. Of course, men are also targeted. Men are also targeted in armed conflict as, sexual, they're raped during armed conflict. But of course, it's not to the same degree as women. And the rape of men in the course of armed conflict is usually meant to feminize, quote unquote, feminize or emasculate them, okay? It's a form of psychological castration. Strip them of their humanity as men, and therefore humiliate and really show that we've defeated you. You're no longer men. So gender-based violence is really a means of control and oppression in every way. So from that discussion, what are the main concepts that you take out? If you decide, I am going, and there are several projects amongst you, the laureates, that are focusing on gender-based violence, different forms of gender-based violence. What are the concepts that you may find useful from this discussion? Yes?
Yeah, for me, I would look at the caricature of the tree, where you have to base more on the root causes and not just the facilitating factors, or maybe only responding to the manifestations, because the manifestations practically give us the clue of what is happening in society, what the society is about. I'm talking from the perspective of the South African society, where we have every year over 500,000 rapes, reported rapes. So you can imagine those which are not reported. So they estimate that almost every 5 minutes a woman is raped, either in marriage or even outside marriage, in different forms. Even men are raped as well. There are lots of cases that have also been reported in South Africa of men being raped. So there is too much, violence, gender-based violence in all forms for both women and men, but particularly women, at all categories, young women, old women, and so on and so on, even kids of months old and so on. So it is so dire to a certain extent that I think this is very important to try to find the root causes of this particular act. I wanted to relate it to ask Prof, on whether the abused can as well, the concept of the abused being the abusers also, applied in this context, because we find there was too much oppression in the past and a bit of, decadence and hopelessness, but now that things are also changing and they are changing of power dynamics, we see these things happening, is it only cultural, patriarchal, or it can also be related to having been oppressed, before? Thank you.
I'm not sure I understood your question, but what everything that you, before the question, that you were elaborating, can you reduce it to a concept? Because I'm looking for concept. It could be a phrase, it could be one word, but a concept that you would use. Okay? Yes, Claire. You asked the question.
Yes.
I think a common concept used by some organisations is failed masculinities. But I remember that Jane said something about how this was a misconception in itself. I mean, to simplify matters, maybe to say, because a man feels failed that he'll beat on a woman. I don't know.
Okay, there are two, I think there are two sides of that coin, or that concept, failed masculinities. You could argue that because someone has failed to live up to the standard that has been set by society of a typical masculinity, okay? Therefore, they are seen as, failed masculinity, as a failed, for example, a man who walks like this and talks like this.
He's a sissy.
Yes, society looks at him as that is failed masculinity. He is not living up to. Okay? And therefore, the mechanisms of surveillance will get him. Okay? You will read in the newspapers, this man who pretends to be a woman was arrested and thrown in jail. That is the surveillance mechanism getting him. Telling him, you must conform. Okay, so because of this failed masculinity, he will suffer violence, gender-based violence. But on the other hand, like we discussed last week, a person, an individual who feels that they have failed in living up to the standard notions of masculinity, okay, may, because of that failure, okay, for example, standard masculinity, typical masculinity requires that a man is the breadwinner. He is the one who goes out to work and provides for his family. But because of the economic circumstances, he has looked for employment for years and he can't. Okay? He lost his job and for 2 years he cannot provide for his family. He feels that he is a failed masculinity. And therefore, the frustration that comes with that forces him. One of the ways that it manifests itself is through being violent on the less privileged person, wife, children, and so on. So the violence can be seen through this concept of failed masculinities on both sides. What other? So failed masculinity is one concept that comes out of this. Okay, being gendered, being a gendered being. Yes?
From the first one, violence as a means of control and oppression. I think it conceptualizes violence itself for us to look at it from a perspective where we are seeing it as a means of ensuring that we control what we want within our society, regulating it, and within that, like you also said, it becomes institutional and structural, which are other concepts that break away from violence as a means of control and oppression.
Thank you very much. I think once you recognize that violence is about control and oppression, then you will not, in your analysis, when you are studying and researching violence, you will not focus so much on someone's temper or someone's, say, these men, who were raised, that he has a bad temper, therefore, because he is an alcoholic, we need to work on alcoholism. Those just facilitate. But this need to control and oppress comes from deeper roots that buttress this tree of violence. Okay? So yes, conceptualizing violence as control and oppression will help you in your analysis. So for example, this man that rapes, okay? Once you realize that violence is about control and oppression, you are not going to focus on, oh, these soldiers, because they've been away from their wives for so long, they want to satisfy their sexual urges. It's not about that. It's not about that at all. You will have gone wrong if you don't realize that violence is about control and oppression. Thank you. Yes, Esther.